There it is. Okay, so the two herbs that I'm going to talk about today are tilia and rosemary. Oh, you have a bear in your woods? That's fascinating. That's great. Tilia and rosemary are two of the herbs that I want to talk about today. Tilia is also called linden or basswood. It's tree. Can be a pretty large tree. It's known for its soft carvable wood, but medicinally, the flowering bodies are the part that's used, which is a long green modified leaf with a stem coming out of it that has several flowers on it, and those flowers ripen into round little round fruits that are initially green and then they turn brown. It's a relative of mallow, and it's also a relative of chocolate and baobab trees and kapok trees and cotton. So they're all in the mallow family. Yeah, tilia can be a really big tree. Sometimes it will be a smaller understory tree growing under larger trees, but most of the time in our environment, it's a full-size tree. There is a tilia tree in Lexington that is one of the biggest in the world. Sometimes is and sometimes isn't considered the biggest in the country, but it's growing in Lexington Cemetery near the grave of Henry Clay, and it's I'd say it's about 8 feet across, and the width of the tree is about as long as a 2x4, as a piece of lumber. So it's about 8 feet across, and has very gnarly, knobby part of the trunk as it reaches the ground. The crown was damaged a few years ago, so there's less of it than there used to be, but it's a massive tree. And there are lots of other linden trees that are growing as landscaping around Lexington. And there are lots of tilia trees out in the woods as well. They are pollinated by insects. They do have more showy looking flowers that attract bees, and very sweet smelling flowers that attract bees and other pollinators.
Tree.
And so they can be pretty large trees, or if they're cut down, they'll often grow up in like multiple small trunks from the root system, and in that case they can be kind of little thickets. And the medicinal properties are mainly that it's used for calming. Tilia can be taken internally as a tea. It also has a tradition of being used topically as a calming remedy, like infusing bath water with a small sachet of tilia flowers to help promote sleep afterwards. And also foot soaks, making an infusion of tilia and then soaking your feet in it has been used in the same way. But usually if I'm using it, I have people use it internally. It's pleasant tasting and works quickly. And it doesn't tend to have a lingering effect. Like if somebody is concerned about being drowsy the next day from things they're taking to help them sleep, tilia is less likely to do that than some other herbs like skullcap or chamomile even. Not that those are especially likely to do that, but if you're using skullcap or passion flower or chamomile and it's making somebody feel drowsy the next day, Tilia can be really helpful for that. Tilia, I also like Tilia for a specific type of situation in which there is grief with anxiety.
Tilia.
According to Wikipedia, Tilia is a genus.
Janelle, could you mute your audio?
Sorry, I thought
All right. So, yeah, it's used for grief that's accompanied by anxiety. It's not exactly an antidepressant, but if someone is feeling anxious and stressed as a result of a loss or of grief, it can sometimes really be helpful and soothing to them. It's very soothing to the nervous system. I sometimes use it along with stronger things for post-traumatic type stress situations. And it's helpful for that because, you know, a lot of the time I'm trying to get somebody to a point where they can not be too anxious, but not be too tired either. And, or not feel too stressed, but not be too tired either. So it's helpful for that in being a mild, calming, soothing sedative that's not very dramatic in its sedative properties, not very overwhelming. So it doesn't make it so that people have to struggle to stay awake or something like that. So yeah, it's a good plant to know. And sometimes in the summertime when it's blooming, sometimes you can smell the tree if you're out in the woods, and it has a fairly distinctive smell that is actually recognizable. So sometimes you can smell it before you see it. And sometimes you can also hear bees buzzing around it before you see it as well. So those are things you can use to help you look for it in the woods. Another thing that this plant is used for that is not necessarily a part of its medicinal properties, or it could be, but it produces bast, which is a fibrous layer of stringy stuff between the bark and the trunk. And this is probably where the name basswood and also the name linden, which is kind of like line or linen, comes from, is the fact that cordage, string, rope, that sort of thing has traditionally been made out of this underlayer of bark. It can also be used as an absorbent material or type of padding. It's not as absorbent as cotton or anything like that, but it's something that can be made into basketry or strings or things like that. So just in getting to know this plant, that's a good thing to know about it, is that it does have that property. It also has a wood that's kind of considered probably the best wood around to carve things out of, because it's soft enough, but it holds its shape well. It doesn't, it's not as soft as pine, but it's a lot more resilient to damage and handling and things like that. So it's often been used for like, carving reliefs into, or carving simple things like spoons or spatulas out of. So it's a good tree to know of, to be able to recognize, and it's native here. There's a different species that's native in Europe and Asia, and it's very much used in the folk medicine of those places. When I was learning about Russian traditional medicine, when I was in Kazakhstan and that part of the world, it was definitely one of the most household herbs, like one of the things that people were most likely to keep around the house as a home remedy. And very, very much used, very much loved traditional medicine in that part of the world. And, also native here and used by people here since time out of mind as well. or largely the same sets of purposes, same types of purposes. It's also mildly soothing to the digestive tract. If somebody's having like cramps in their digestive system, it helps with that. If somebody's having bleeding from their digestive system, it's not really the first thing I would use for that, but it does help somewhat. The fruit in particular, if it's ground up and crushed up, is somewhat demulcent. Some people say it tastes like chocolate. I don't taste the resemblance, but it is smooth and soothing. It reminds me more of okra or mallow fruits than it does of chocolate, but they're all related to each other. And it has some of the same substances as all of them. So that is about what I have to say for now about the mighty tilia tree. The other herb I wanted to talk about is rosemary. Salvia rosmarinus is its current scientific name. A lot of the time, you'll also see it as Rosmarinus officinalis. That was what it was called for many generations. And it's a common kitchen spice, kitchen herb. It can pretty easily be grown indoors. It's part of the mint family. It's native to a Mediterranean climate. So it grows well in places like Italy and the Balkans. But you can grow it inside pretty easily if it's got good light. You can grow it outside during the summertime, and you can even bring it inside, and it can live for years and be a perennial essentially. If you grow it outside, it will die to the ground when it gets cold out, and then may come back or can be replanted again the next year. It's very aromatic. It contains its distinctive, the substance that gives it its distinctive flavor is probably rosmarinic acid, or that's one of them. There are several, but that's like kind of the main one, rosmarinic acid, which is an aromatic acid. And it's kind of like what tastes different in rosemary compared to oregano or marjoram is the rosmarinic acid mainly. It also contains carboxyl and some of the other spicy type essential oil or aromatic compounds, volatile compounds that are in some other mint family plants like rosemary and marjoram and monarda, which we saw on our herb walk out in the woods. Bee balm. So it's got some of the same stuff and some different stuff. I use rosemary for a couple of different, largely unrelated purposes. One of those purposes is as a remedy for the head and for movement of fluids in the head, circulation to the brain. So it can help with preventing migraines. It can help with congestion and preventing sinus pressure and headaches, and relieving congestion, especially congestion that's up in the sinuses rather than in the chest. It'll work in both places because it's working on the same type of cells, but it seems to have an affinity for the organs of the head and the structures of the head. So it's traditionally been used for that. This is kind of in a lot of healing traditions that are strongly influenced by the Greek and Roman healing traditions. It might be called a cephalic, meaning that it works on the head specifically, that it has an affinity for that part of the body. So that's how Galen, for instance, would probably have described it. And a lot of Western medicine, Western herbalism, for the last couple thousand years has been very influenced by Galen and by his predecessors as well, and they're kind of thinking about how plants work. So even though the head is, a lot of different structures and functions, it's sort of like physically viewable as part of the body, even though it's, more like an area of the body than a specific part. But it's often been thought of as a sovereign remedy, or as a remedy that has a particular affinity for that part of the body or that area of the body. So it's useful for congestion. It's useful for circulation to the brain, which has relevance to migraines, also has a relevance to memory. And rosemary has a long history of use as a plant for memory, as a remedy for loss of memory that was either due to head injury or to age. Sometimes other causes, but those tend to be the main ones. So it is seemingly pretty helpful for that. How much of that is just circulation to the brain, how much of it is something else, is difficult to say, but it does seem to be pretty helpful. Often what I see, if someone has memory problems, it will kind of produce an effect pretty quickly and then sort of plateau. So like people who take rosemary will start to notice a difference within a month or so, but it doesn't keep getting better and better. It just kind of gets a certain amount better and then stays there. And usually, if they take the rosemary for a few months and then stop taking it, maybe it will just stay at that better level. Sometimes it slowly returns to getting worse. And if somebody has an age-related thing, I usually recommend that they keep taking it, just because their age is going to keep going up. And so their age-related problems are likely to, progress if not kept in check. But when it's from something like a head injury or an accident, sometimes it's sort of helps, and then you don't have to keep doing it. So that's a good herb for that sort of thing. One of the few herbs that I really notice a lot of success with for chronic memory problems is rosemary. And it's also, very well tolerated. It's not an herb that you have to worry about somebody overdosing on, getting too much of. Some herbs that affect memory, if you get too much of them, you start to maybe have psychoactive effects, misperceptions and things like that. And you don't really get that with rosemary, not at any dose that I've ever encountered anyway. So it's good for that. It's also an antiseptic. So an infusion or tincture of rosemary will kill bacteria, it will kill fungi. It will generally kind of cleanse areas. If you wash a wound out with rosemary, it's not only going to kill the germs it comes in contact with, it's going to increase the circulation to the area, might increase some drainage, and might bring some stuff to the surface that was not initially right at the surface. So it's astringent, and it's antiseptic. It's a good thing for wounds that maybe are not healing on their own. If anytime I have somebody that has an open sore that's not healing with regular wound care, rosemary is something that I sometimes will consider, because it's pretty good for both increasing the circulation to the area and killing the germs there. And the lack of circulation and the presence of microorganisms can both be barriers to healing. So it works on both of those things. Plus, it's astringent and has some healing promoting properties of its own. Rosemary and yarrow together is also good for that sort of thing. We've talked about yarrow before. Yeah, so Becca is talking about using a rosemary tincture for focus, and that's definitely something that it can be helpful with too, because like I said, it's just sort of a remedy for the head is one way of looking at it, even to the extent that people have used it for things like hair growth or keeping hair from turning gray, which I'm not sure how well it works, because with those sorts of cosmetic things, people will try anything and people will promote anything. And so sometimes things that don't work end up, getting, or that don't work that often, end up getting promoted as though they did. But, at a minimum, it is somewhat cleansing and going to be invigorating to the scalp. And in some cases that might result in, thicker, fuller, less gray hair. So yeah, rosemary is a good one to know about, and an easy one to grow. Not something you'll ever encounter wild here in this part of the country. Further south, maybe you could find it as a escapee from cultivation or something like that. And then, in parts of Europe, it genuinely will grow completely on its own. So yeah, some I've had people say that they thought that rosemary was a conifer, like it was a type of pine or something, because of the shape of the leaves, and maybe the smell is a little bit piney, but it's not. It's a member of the mint family. It doesn't have the square stem that a lot of mints have, 'cause it has a more bushy habit, but it does have mint-like flowers when it blooms. If you ever see the flowers when they bloom, they look like little purple mint flowers. So it's a member of the mint family, and now more specifically, it's considered a member of the sage genus, along with kitchen sage and clary sage and diviner's sage and various other California white sage, all sorts of things. Yeah, rosemary for congestion is good stuff. It's like uh, it's kind of similar to camphor, but it's gentler without giving up much in the way of effectiveness compared to, say, camphor or tea tree oil. It's got a kind of a similar feel to it. So the therapeutics topic that I want to talk about this time is foot care. So feet issues are a really common thing, a really good thing to know how to treat on your own, because most of them are not life-threatening or anything. It's a really good area to familiarize yourself with. A lot of people are kind of grossed out by other people's feet, and that's just one of the unfortunate parts for some people of doing healing work, is that sometimes things are gross, but if it doesn't bother you much, that's a good sign. I 30 years ago, when I first started practicing as an herbalist in earnest, I'd been studying it before that, but when I really first started seeing people a lot, I was working a lot with homeless people, and I was working a lot with traveling people at gatherings and things like that. And foot issues were incredibly common, maybe close to universal among those populations. So feet really take a beating. People walk around on them all day, and shoes, even though they protect feet from external things, they also change how we walk and can have both short-term and long-term damage to the feet that they cause, especially depending on the types of shoes. So I'm going to talk about a few different categories of issues that go on with the feet, and kind of just give a general brief overview into some things that you're likely to see with people's feet in the course of your life, and some strategies for dealing with them. I want to talk about injuries to the feet, and I want to talk about infections, and then I want to talk about structural issues. So injuries on the feet are pretty similar to injuries anywhere else. You get the same types of, abrasions, punctures, things like that. Some of the more common things that you would see with injuries to a foot would include a blister or sore from rubbing from a shoe that was rubbing against the foot or pinching too tightly on the foot, or a puncture wound from someone stepping on something, or a contusion or impact wound, like a blunt force trauma wound that would come from running your foot into something. We've all done that, right? Walking and stubbed a toe or bent a toe backwards on something or something like that. Feet also get things dropped on them. They're a common place for animal bites to happen. And so those are some, really common types of things you might see with injuries to feet. For the most part, you're going to treat those injuries in a similar way that you would were they occurring elsewhere on the body, but there are some additional considerations, both in terms of re-injury happening because of the way that feet are used and also contamination. So puncture wounds are a great example of something like that. Say somebody's playing outside, a kid or someone like that, and they step on a nail, right? And so immediately you have not only a puncture wound, but you have whatever was on the nail getting introduced into the foot. And that could be a reason to get a tetanus shot or something like that. But additionally, when someone has stepped on something like that, then they've got to maybe get back to the house to ask for help or get somewhere to ask for help, right? Which might mean stepping on the same foot over and over, possibly while the foreign object is still in it. If the object is not still in it, then you also are coming in contact with the ground over and over, or maybe with the inside of a shoe over and over, which is not necessarily a sanitary surface, and which is, leading to the possibility of other germs and things like that being introduced. Not only germs, but also foreign matter being introduced into the wound channel, dirt or whatever. So that's a rough situation. That can be a heavy duty sort of injury. If an injury like that is bleeding a lot, it's actually kind of better than if it weren't, because the blood is going to wash it out, sort of. It's going to remove a lot of debris or foreign material from the wound channel. Soaking the foot in hot water after the foot has been wiped off thoroughly and cleaned as well as you can on the outside. Soaking it in some warm water will also help facilitate that process. You can also add something like the rosemary infusion to the warm water, which will have some antiseptic effect and also some astringent effect. I really like rosemary for that. I like yarrow for it as well. Either or both of them can be really good in that scenario. So that's for a puncture wound. If someone has something like a burn or an abrasion that is not a very deep wound, where there's not really where the wound is just on the surface rather than going into the foot, it's a lot easier to clean and it's a lot easier to treat. Just because it's a lot easier to get to whatever is going on with it. Usually in that kind of situation, I will wash the foot out, soak it, and then if it's just something like a surface level wound, I'll often put salve on it. I have this anti-inflammatory salve that I use a lot for first aid type situations that I've talked about before. It's a wintergreen salve with some comfrey and some sesame oil and beeswax in it, and a little bit of mugwort as well. And that's really good for just kind of topical things. If it is a deeper wound, a lot of the time I will put a poultice over it, put a wound dressing on it that might contain a poultice of yarrow, and that will help to draw anything out of the wound, and also help it to close up and heal up. And then once it has closed, I just treat it like a surface injury and put salve on it and bandage it to keep it clean. So that's a really useful thing with adhesive bandages like Band-Aids and that sort of thing, is that you really can use them well for the feet to try and keep the area from getting dirty. And also you can use the little padded area as a carrier, as a foment for some antiseptic tincture or some salve or something like that. They're not really very good for heavily draining wounds or anything like that. And if you had a wound that was draining a lot, you would probably want to use something, a thicker wound dressing. But if it's not leaking or bleeding a lot, then that's something that can be appropriate, and that I often use. And sometimes if someone has a more severe foot injury, which I'm not necessarily saying this is something you should treat on your own, but a couple years ago, for instance, I saw someone who had gotten an axe injury to their foot. And I've seen quite a few axe injuries to feet, because people, when they're camping, if they're not used to cutting wood and things with an axe or a hatchet, sometimes they'll drop it on their foot. Sometimes they'll try to use their foot to hold the log still, and then they'll end up chopping their foot. For whatever reason, people's hatchets and their feet often find each other on camping trips. And so, it's, for some reason, hands get injured by saws and feet get injured by hatchets. I mean, feet aren't really you're not gonna saw through your shoe usually. But you can chop through it with a hatchet or an axe. So I've seen quite a few of those sorts of things over the years. And what you get is a laceration, and sometimes there's a bit of shoe in the wound. But in that sort of situation, when there is a laceration, it's mostly stopping the bleeding, making sure it's clean, closing the wound up, which, if it's stopped bleeding, you can close the wound up with adhesive tape, with wound strips, which are for that. You can usually close a wound up pretty well. Modern adhesives are pretty good for that sort of thing. And then after it's been closed for 12 to 24 hours, it will stay closed without the bandage, and you can put some salve on it, put a bandage over it that's more just to cover it and that sort of thing. Depending on whether the wound is on a place that bends a lot or moves a lot. And that's the other thing with foot wounds, is that feet, they move a lot. If a wound is on a hand or a foot, it's going to get bent and stretched a lot more than it would if it were on most other places on the body, just during the course of regular activity. What were the herbs in the salve? There's a question about what the herbs were in the salve. The salve that I'm talking about contains wintergreen and comfrey and mugwort, and sesame oil and beeswax are the base. And yeah, it was, that was my second project that I devised when I was a young herbalist. That was sort of my first thing that I kind of came up with. It was my own thing based on what I had learned so far, and I still use it pretty often, especially in a first aid type of setting. So injuries on feet need more protection than injuries elsewhere in the body, and they also need more cleansing and more attention to hygiene. Just in general, just speaking in terms of regular first aid injuries like lacerations and punctures and abrasions. they're substantially similar in how you treat them, but they are, on a part of the body that is typically under more duress than the rest of the body. Hang on just a moment. So the second category of things I wanted to talk about is infections to the surface of the feet. Not so much infected wounds on the feet, which is a sort of a more intense topic that I'm not going to get into at this stage, but things like athlete's foot, nail fungus, and bacterial skin infections on the feet, which are really common because feet sweat more than most other parts of the body, and they're encased in shoes for a lot of us for much of the day. So the dampness and heat both give rise to fungi especially, and bacteria also in some cases, which are so damp heat conditions. And you'll you see this in obviously athletes, but also other people as well. People with more limited mobility sometimes have trouble with foot infections because maybe they put their shoes on for the day and then they just leave them on because it's a more trouble for them to take them off. They're less common in older people than they are in younger people. Very common in older children and young adults, people who maybe do a lot of sweating but might not have the best personal hygiene. So that's it's a common thing to see. Also, you see a lot more of them in people who have impaired circulation to their feet, which especially means diabetic people, but is not limited to diabetic people, but it's very common in diabetic people to have fungal infections of the feet or other infections of the feet that are hard to get rid of. It's also very common for people to have impaired circulation if they sit a lot, which might be because their job requires them sitting a lot, like especially if they're drivers, where you might be sitting in the same position for hours and hours because you're driving a car. You see it in people who are in wheelchairs. You're just, because of the position they're in, they're not getting as much blood flow to their feet a lot of the time, and that makes it harder for their immune systems to fight off and to regulate the environment in a way that's not conducive to the development of infections. So like I said, for the most part, these infections involve dampness and heat. So cooling and drying are kind of some of the ways that you might get rid of them. That for some people, that can mean wearing more breathable shoes. It can mean wearing more absorbent socks. So for instance, wool socks often really help because they wick moisture away from the surface and keep the feet from feeling wet, even though they may still be sweating. In some people, the amount more that they sweat outweighs that, but not usually. So wool socks are usually helpful for that type of situation. Shoes that are not very tight are really important. Um, one story that I like to tell is that there was somebody that I worked with who had toenail fungus for decades, since he was in the Army, and was in a situation where his feet were, as he put it, his feet were wet for the entire time that he was deployed in Southeast Asia. And so he got toenail fungus, and it just never went away. And then decades later, when he retired and stopped wearing tight shoes, it kind of cleared up on its own in a matter of less than a year. So it's something that can be very inveterate. It can be toenail fungus especially, but in some people you see this just with athlete's foot in general, which are slightly different funguses living in slightly different parts of the foot, but they're very similar. The main difference from your perspective as a practitioner is that nail fungus is harder to get medicine to because it's actually under the nail. It's in the nail bed, which is under the surface of the nail. So foot soaks can be helpful for that. If someone soaks their feet in liquid for about half an hour, it will soak into the nails well enough that it will get to the nail bed and start to kill the stuff off that's there. With the rest of the foot, it doesn't take nearly as long. And there are all kinds of commercial products for athlete's foot. There are also a lot of herbs that work pretty well. Sesame oil by itself is a pretty good antifungal. I often use oak moss oil, which I haven't really talked that much about oak moss, but it's a lichen. It doesn't grow around here very much. It's pretty common in the Pacific Northwest. It's pretty common in Mediterranean climates. It really likes to grow near the sea, it seems like. But it's very strongly antifungal. And unlike tea tree oil, which is kind of like what a lot of people reach for as an antifungal, tea tree oil evaporates quickly. Oak moss oil doesn't really evaporate. So it stays on there and just kind of keeps working. So that's often something that I would use in that situation. I also like to give people internal antifungals that will come out in their sweat, which asafoetida is one that I use a lot. Ferula, which I know I've talked about that to you before. So that's something that you can take for fungal infection. With again, with the nail fungus, it takes a long time to get rid of it. It's just no matter what you do, you can count on it being several months before it goes away, because it's in the nail bed and it's in the nail, and the nails have to kind of grow out. So however long it takes you to grow a new set of nails, it will take at least that long to get rid of it. The last treatment that I mentioned, taken internally to come out in your sweat and kill fungus, is asafoetida. Ferula asafoetida is the Latin name of it, and it is the ground up crystalline sap from some plants in the celery family. Garlic is somewhat helpful. Garlic does come out in the sweat too, a little bit, but it comes out in the breath more, and some people find it kind of unpleasant to have garlic breath. And asafoetida, which tastes garlicky, doesn't really come out like that. question was, what herbs would I use in a foot soak for nail fungus? Cinnamon is one that I use quite a bit. Another one is Parmelia lichen, which I have I know we looked at it when we were out in the woods once, but it's a pretty common lichen. But yeah, cinnamon is a common thing, is an easy to find thing that is good for that. If you use powdered cinnamon, it's going to kind of make a mess. I have used powdered cinnamon in socks before, which is both warming and antifungal. So that's like increases circulation and is antifungal. But if you get chips of cinnamon, let's see, where is it? When I buy cinnamon to use in my practice, it is organic cinnamon chips, which are just crunchy chunks of cinnamon bark. And if you want to make an extract of this, whether it's a tincture or whatever, you want to allow it some time to steep, like maybe overnight. And it's sort of it's got a demulcent property to it. It's got some slippery mucilaginous stuff that comes out of it that is it's got good staying power that will soak into the skin and soften the skin while killing fungus, and then it will kind of remain in the skin and have the skin infused with the cinnamon stuff for the next day or so. And so that was a good thing to use. It's antifungal. Sandalwood, if you have it, is good to use as well. It's not as nearly as easy to find as cinnamon, but it's generally possible to purchase sandalwood oil. But the thing about the sandalwood oil that you can buy is it's usually sandalwood in jojoba oil, and how much of it's actually sandalwood oil versus jojoba oil is kind of like not something that they're necessarily specifying when they sell it to you. But that can be a good thing to use. And so I mentioned the lichens, and astringent things like oak or raspberry leaf can be helpful too. They're just kind of tightening up the pores so there's not as much dampness over the course of the next day. And then sage and rosemary are good as well. They're also pretty good for killing fungus, and also good for killing bacteria. Bacteria that you get on the feet are often staph and strep type bacteria, which are generally on people's skin. They're common skin organisms, but sometimes they'll kind of turn into open sores. They'll create open sores, or they'll get into small injuries and turn them into larger open sores. And it can be really important to treat those as quickly as possible to get rid of them. Yeah, I'm not really sure about the conservation status of sandalwood either. That's a good point. There's definitely, it's not a very common plant, and there's potential for over harvesting. So whereas cinnamon is pretty well commercially cultivated and things like that, so it's the supply of it is a little more secure. Yeah, there are a lot of different plants out there that have antifungal properties because plants need them to keep fungi from killing the plants that are in the environment. But some of them are much more uh, widely used than others, or much more readily available to use than others. Um, and a lot of the time, with fungal infections on the feet, they are kind of secondary. So you want to get rid of them, but preventing them is more important. And the way you prevent them is by having good circulation and keeping the feet from being damp too much of the time, especially with sweat and especially with um, good foot hygiene, which includes not only washing them, but also wearing clean socks and wearing socks and not wearing shoes that don't, where you wouldn't wear socks. So if somebody has athlete's foot and they're trying to get rid of it, it's a really bad idea for them to wear any kind of shoes that doesn't require socks, where their feet are going to be directly in contact with the shoe, because the fungus actually get onto the shoe and then from the shoe back onto the feet. So it's with sandals you can clean them off a little more easily, but with most other kinds of shoes, that's not such a good idea. Yeah, the rosemary foot soak will decrease foot odor, and actually, if you take rosemary internally, it will also sometimes decrease uh, foot odor as well, just because it's changing the metabolites are coming out through the sweat, and they're changing the environment in which it's actually bacteria, lactic acid bacteria on the feet that are making the sweat start to smell. So when sweat comes out, it usually doesn't have much of a smell, but it develops a smell pretty quickly, partly by being fermented by bacteria that are on the surface of the body. So yeah, rosemary helps with that. Sage helps with it as well. Some people say sage also decreases the volume of sweat. I think that differs from person to person as to whether that's true, though. So yeah, the foot hygiene is really important. And then if there are infections, any kind of bacterial infection, golden seal is really good topically for. I often use golden seal and myrrh if there's like a sore on the foot or something like that, to just try and make it an inhospitable as possible an environment for bacteria like staph that can keep those sores from closing up, or make the sores get bigger and deeper, which is often what happens. So yeah, chaparral is another topical herb that some people that I've seen. It's not an herb that I use very much at all because it's not something that is very widely available around here. But there was an herbalist from the Southwest called Michael Moore, and a significant number of the practicing herbalists in the country are either his students or the students of his students. And a lot of them really like chaparral because it is traditional medicine in that part of the country. Creosote bush is another word for it, but it is a good topical anti-infective that can be used on the feet and elsewhere. So that's something that you may see people using out there. It was very popular as an internal remedy at one point, but some people had some liver damage that appeared to be associated with it. So it's not very widely sold anymore. It was not widely sold at all for a long time, and it's made a little bit of a comeback in more recent times. And the other thing with foot care is it's really important with anything that involves that might involve infection, whether it's a wound, whether it's a newly occurred wound, whether it's a sore, whether it's um, a fungal infection or a bacterial infection, that sort of thing. It's really important to keep an eye on it and to follow up frequently and not let things go too far. The thing about people's feet is that they're a long ways from your eyes, and some people can't see their feet very well, and some people, can't reach their feet very well either, especially older people or people with limited mobility. And so it's really possible for a foot issue to get out of hand quickly just because their feet are exposed to, harsher environments and harsher usage than most of the rest of the body. So it's important to stay on top of them basically, and try and make sure that healing is happening and is moving in the right direction consistently. Another thing you sometimes see with feet, and this is especially true in diabetic people, but not by no means at all, by no means unique to them, is that sometimes there will be sores that maybe come up for no obvious reason and just stick around and don't want to heal. And this is often a lack of circulation to those sores. It's often if somebody is diabetic, the fact that their blood sugar is higher will often make the sore a much more habitable place for microorganisms, for bacteria. And these can get really, really gnarly. I don't want to go into too much gory detail, but they can get very infective, and they can get necrotic, which is like where there's, dead tissue sort of rotting. And so that can be a difficult thing to treat. Might not be a good do-it-yourself project if it gets really bad, but essentially it's a lot like cleaning out any other wound, and might require scrubbing it out or scraping it out. But you have to be careful not to damage healthy tissue or alive tissue. Yeah, it's like a bed sore. The only difference is that, well, it's a pressure ulcer, and a bed sore is also a pressure ulcer. But sometimes a bed sore is just caused by someone laying still and not being able to move themselves, whereas a diabetic foot sore or something similar might start out the same way, but then a lot of the time it will progress if their blood sugar is higher, especially, or even just because the circulation to the feet is not very good. And so not a lot of immune cells are getting carried there. Not a lot of nerve messages are getting received from there. In those situations, it can be more resistant to healing, or have a harder time healing. So let's see, what does somebody say here? Yeah, honey soaked bandages and a frankincense spray. That's a pretty good strategy. So honey actually kind of makes the environment too sugary and too damp for a lot of bacteria, but it does seem to help with getting these to heal sometimes. Frankincense is anti-inflammatory and antiseptic, and it's sticky, so it sticks around. So that can be a good thing too. A lot of the time what I do is wash them out. Sometimes I will clean them with a spray of an antiseptic herb like rosemary or like heal-all or yarrow. Any of those are pretty good for this. Use that to clean them out, irrigate them, basically just kind of rinse them multiple times with some kind of spray or stream of moving liquid, which could just be water, but I often will use an herbal spray, an herbal infusion for this, but you want it to be sterile. You want it to be freshly made with boiling water so that it's not going to be bringing any germs into the process. And then poultice it with something that is going to help to get it to heal. Honey bandages can be really good. You can actually even buy honey bandages that are pre-made these days, but you can also just take honey and put it on bandages as well. A lot of them are like Manuka honey bandages and stuff, and that probably matters a little bit, but it's not the only thing. Um, as far as what kind of honey it is, but it a lot of the time I will use that along with some herbs that are good for wound healing. I like yarrow. I also like castor oil for non-healing foot wounds, and I like to make an infusion of mullein flowers in castor oil. So making an oil infusion using castor oil as the base and infusing mullein flowers into it, then rubbing that on the wound before putting the bandage over it is often a really helpful thing to do. And in addition to that, you want to work on moving the lymph, reducing swelling, working on the kidneys sometimes. Sometimes people retain water in their feet. If their kidneys are not working well, the feet swell. If they're not moving their bodies enough and not circulating their lymph fluid, sometimes the feet swell because of that too. And you'll get very thick, swollen legs, lower legs that will pit when you press them. If you press a finger into it, it just leaves the indentation of your finger like memory foam. So when you have that situation going on, it's also important to work systemically to try and get the excess fluid out of there by way of either working on the spleen and the lymph system, which I like sarsaparilla for that, or working on the kidneys, which I often use sumac and reindeer moss for. Corn silk is good too, uva ursi, lots of other herbs that stimulate the kidneys and remove excess fluid from the body, and also positionally elevating the feet and moving the body around when practical and possible are also really helpful for that situation. And then of course, if it is diabetic, doing whatever is possible to try and keep blood sugar under control is really important too. So it's important not to lose sight of root causes like that, but it's also important to treat the immediate effects, because those effects can become devastating injuries pretty quickly in some cases.
Andrew, I have a question.
Okay.
So with people who are prone to things like pitting edemas in lower extremities, foot sores, bed sores, swelling, all those things.
Uh-huh.
I mean, typically those people come with a specific set of issues anyway. Would something like, once you get the problem kind of under control, would it be appropriate to do some sort of like tonic remedies for major systems, since clearly like the whole body is kind of freaking out a little bit, like do more of mild tonics that are easy for them to do on a daily basis along with diet changes? Would that be something that would be beneficial for someone like that?
Yeah, that generally is a beneficial thing for someone in that type of situation. And, I mean, sometimes, yeah, I mean, you're right. They tend to have, a whole set of issues already. And, but sometimes, supporting those systems of the body, like the lymph system and like the kidneys and like the circulatory system and the endocrine system, is really important. And sometimes a tonic or adaptogen type of thing can be a good thing for all of that. I would often give somebody in that type of situation some support that was like a tonic or adaptogen for their whole body, and then maybe some stuff to address specific systems, and then maybe some stuff to address specific symptoms as well, like things for the sores and stuff like that. but yeah, it's a, tends to be complicated cases. Tends to be people with chronic issues that have been going on for a while, and they cause other issues too. If somebody has, for example, if somebody's kidneys are not working well and not filtering uh, waste products out of their body as well as they should be, then you get this situation where there's edema in the lower extremities and non-healing sores and that sort of thing. But those sores also create things like breaking down proteins that the kidneys need to deal with. So it can be very self-perpetuating, and sometimes it can get out of control really quickly if it's not dealt with. So yeah, it is important to work on the major systems and big picture stuff, as well as the specific more minor things. So yeah, tonics can be helpful for that.
It's a hard thing to try and get people to do, though. I'm finding that with my own family, just like, because you can't just say, oh, take this, take that. It's a whole thing. You can't just treat a few things. You have to treat the whole entire body. And it's so hard, especially with like diabetics in particular. They got the taste for that sugar, and that is a hard habit to kick, So that's the
Sure.
thing I'm finding hard.
Yeah, it can be very difficult. It can be very difficult. Um, so yeah, and you only have so much control of it. You're there to facilitate, not control. So you really only have so much that you can do about the decisions that they're going to make for how they maintain their bodies and things like that. You're there to provide them options and possibilities, and they're going to decide what they're going to do with that.
It is hard to watch though,
Oh,
especially if it's someone like something as
sure.
simple as just like removing fast food and sugar from your diet can make the world of difference. And just watching them just repeatedly just ingest this crap. It's so
Oh,
hard to watch it.
I know. It's the case in my practice that really drove this home to me was I was working with somebody with celiac disease who just would not stop eating wheat, and their other doctors told them, and I told them that if you don't stop eating wheat, it's going to kill you. And she said that she would rather die than stop eating it, because she felt like everything good in life involved, every kind of celebration in our culture and stuff like that involved uh, baked goods and things like that, and she just couldn't see having a life without it, and she did die. She didn't stop doing it, and eventually she did die from it, and it was just it's pretty tragic that she even when it was real for her, even when she really got what the consequences were, she just was not able to make that choice. So it's a
Oh gosh,
strange
that's so
thing.
sad.
It's very sad. Yeah, it's a strange thing that people would feel that way. I mean, it's hard for me to imagine, but people have their attachments, and that's just kind of part of the human condition, I guess. But
And our culture probably too.
and our culture too, yeah, for sure. But it's hard to it can be very tragic. It can be hard to watch, hard to cope with emotionally, especially when there's like a simple solution, a simple if unpleasant solution that would fix everything. But
One thing I
yeah,
like to
so
remember.
if
The
Thank
one thing I
you.
like to
yeah,
the one thing I like to remember when
hmm
people have allergies is that no matter what allergy they have, it can kill them. Like a nut allergy can kill a kid like in an instant, right? So if you
Right.
have a gluten allergy, the more you eat it, the more it's just killing your insides faster
R-
than you
Yeah,
going to a non-gluten diet.
sure,
But that's
sure.
any allergy.
Yeah, and with allergies, I mean, celiac is a little different than an allergy, but with allergies in particular, they can sometimes become much more severe without warning. Yeah, a former classmate of my daughter's died last year because she had an allergic reaction to something she'd previously only been mildly allergic to, but she had a severe reaction, and it was over before anybody could do anything about it.
Oh, I
So
hate
yeah,
that.
yeah, it was terrible. So in that kind of situation, avoidance is really, really important, because usually things do get more severe with subsequent exposures, all other things being equal. All right, so I have a question of, do I work with Tilia bark therapeutically? I don't know if the European species contains quinine. It may contain some bitter substances, though. I don't really use the bark therapeutically. I mostly just use the flowers. Then the other question is, for rosemary for memory issues, would you begin with 5 milliliters of tincture 2 to 3 times a day? I might. If it was a severe memory issue, I would probably start with a dose that high. A lot of the time, I would start with 5 milliliters once a day, and sometimes that's all it takes. 5 milliliters in the morning. But you could do a larger dose, and like I said, there's not really a dose that I've ever encountered that causes any kind of meaningful problems. Uh, Plus, it's really good for the digestion and stuff too. Rosemary also, I didn't even get into this part, but rosemary contains some substances that help promote digestion. And if you use a poultice of rosemary, it can help break down growths that are on the skin. So things like um, uh, like moles or age spots or things like that. Sometimes a poultice of rosemary will actually cause them to sort of peel off, break apart. So that's their area of use that it has. But yeah, usually when using it for memory internally, I would just use a teaspoon a day, 5 milliliters once a day, something like that, as a starting dose. Sometimes I might do more than that. Sometimes I will load somebody in with a larger dose and then switch to a maintenance dose that's smaller, because that way people are more likely to see quick results and things like that. But yeah, a lot of the time the 5 milliliter dose is sufficient.
Would rosemary infused oil also have a good effect on things like moles and removing things, or would it not quite work as well?
Doesn't quite work as well as the water-based part of it. I think that it's
Gotcha.
something to do somewhat the acidity in the water, the acidity from the rosemary coming out into the water. So using like a wet poultice of it can kind of acts differently.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry, I've been too chatty tonight.
No, not at all. Not at all. So we talked about infections and sores and more direct injuries like punctures and lacerations and things like that. Another category of really pervasive issues with feet is longer term injuries involving the joints of the feet. This can include fallen arches, toes getting misshapen or jammed together or twisted. And mostly this is from shoes that are not shaped like feet. Hardly any shoes are actually shaped the way that people's feet are shaped, especially the front part of the shoe. And so that tends to cause some squishing together of the toes. If the shoe is causing people to bear weight on the ball of their foot but not providing arch support, then over time that can cause arches to lose some of their curvature and get flattened. And then also, if shoes don't support your ankle, then you can they can end up creating leverage against your ankle that sort of makes your ankle turn more than it would. So all of these are just walking in shoes and how that affects the feet. And of course, if you're wearing something with a heel and it's forcing your foot downwards, putting gravity in a different direction in your foot than it normally would be, so that you're stepping down onto the ball of your foot with a lot of weight behind it, the way you would in a high-heeled shoe or a cowboy boot. That can, especially over time, if you do that for a night, you're just like, oh, my feet really hurt. If you do that 9 to 5 for years, then you end up causing actual physical damage. So when somebody's feet are like that, and especially if they're coming to you for help, it usually means that there's a significant amount of ongoing pain involving those things. So the first and most important thing is, don't wear shoes like that. Wear comfortable shoes, wear good orthotics in the shoes, and that can make a lot of difference. And when we talked about back pain, I talked about how the shock absorption in the heel can make a big difference in lower back pain as well. It can make a big difference in heel pain, and it can make a big difference in, sometimes, people will develop bone spurs if there's repeated stress to the heel. Sometimes people also get micro fractures in the bones of their foot as well from marching especially, but sometimes just from walking a lot on hard surfaces. Like if somebody's working in a retail store where they're essentially walking around on a concrete slab all day. It has some nicer flooring over it, some tiles or whatever, but it's still basically a concrete slab, and it's it's very hard on their feet. So sometimes people in that kind of situation will develop microfractures. And in older people who have less bone density naturally, you'll see more of these microfractures than you will in most younger people. In younger people, you get them from marching in the army or something like that, running marathons. People who run do a lot of damage to their feet a lot of the time. So avoiding the source of the injury is obviously, step one, the most important thing insofar as it's possible, because, people, if they're doing something for a job, they can't necessarily easily give that up. But that's the most important first step, is to try and keep the injury from perpetually happening. And then decreasing inflammation is really important. A lot of the time, increasing circulation is really important, and repairing circulation can be really important. And of course, relieving pain. So ginger is one good herb for that, because it's anti-inflammatory. It's a good anti-inflammatory for the joints in particular, and it also improves circulation and relieves pain. So that's something that you might use. The salicylates, all the stuff that we talked about about an inflammation all along, things like willow or violets, taken internally, can be really helpful for reducing the swelling in the joints of the feet, so that the feet can fit better together. Nettle is helpful in this scenario as well, because it's increasing circulation and it's helping to repair tissue. Learning to move in a lower impact way, which might might involve wearing different shoes, but also learning to step differently can make a difference as well. But as far as herbs go, I really liked ginger for this. Turmeric, which we talked about before, is similar. Warming herbs for the feet, like cayenne, topically can be helpful as well. Sometimes there's essentially scarring or swelling of the joints that isn't really going to go all the way away, but a lot of the time, doing a good strong dose of anti-inflammatories for a month or so can make a big difference. If somebody is able to take a little bit of time off their feet, that can be really good too, or a little bit of time where they're not on their feet as much, that can really help too. You know, a lot of people, because of the social expectations around what kind of shoes you wear at work, which was much more of a thing for the people who are old now than it is for people who are in the workforce. For most people who are in the workforce now, you know, not as many of us have had to be in a situation where it was considered, you know, unprofessional to wear athletic shoes to work, for instance. Most places are okay with that nowadays, whereas, you know, in the 80s might have been considered more inappropriate or too casual or something like that. You know, a lot of people spent a lot of years wearing really inappropriate shoes to work in offices and stores and things like that. And then, of course, if you're doing something like construction where you're wearing heavier boots that are protective equipment, that's kind of a different set of issues, but it can be hard on the feet also. So, you know, trying to address that inflammation is really helpful. If somebody's able to reduce the amount that they're using their feet temporarily, not for a long time, but just temporarily to give things a little bit of a chance to reset themselves, that can be really helpful. I've sometimes used the wintergreen salve that I mentioned before. I've used that on people's feet and wrapped them in bandages, and you know, it's just, well, wrap them in gauze soaked in the salve actually, and then some K-tape, or not K-tape, stretch wrap type tape around that, just to hold it in place. And sometimes doing that for 24 hours can really reduce the amount of swelling in the joints, and sometimes, you know, allow things to fit back together in a better way than they might have for a long time. Yeah, high heels can be pretty scary. Some people really like the way they look, but they're pretty bad for your feet. Yeah, also really bad for your feet are just shoes that don't have any shock absorption in them, that don't have any sort of padded insole. Such things shouldn't necessarily exist in this day and age. We really have the technology to make shoes soft inside now, and, you know, not so hard on your feet. And it doesn't cost that much more, but a lot of shoes just aren't made like that. Especially shoes like loafers, high heels, anything that's considered more formal looking is more likely to be bad for your feet, which seems kind of absurd. But you know, not as much you can do about it. That's the material culture, and, you know, unless you can make shoes, you really can't do anything about it other than try and select the best things that are available out there. But you know, there are expensive orthotics that are really, really good, and then there are cheap ones that are 80% as good at least. You know, so it's important to just have some kind of shock absorption in your shoes. If you buy new boots and they don't have good shock absorbent insoles in them, go get some and put them in there. It'll make a difference. The shoes that I usually wear, they come with a very basic insole, and they can be pretty uncomfortable. But if I put a better insole in them, then they're much better to wear. And I like the rest of the shoe. I like a practical shoe that's durable and things like that. But it's the insole that it comes with is kind of not so great, not very substantial at all. But if I buy something from the drugstore that costs $20 or so, it makes them much nicer. So yeah, long-term structural changes to the foot are the hardest of these different categories to really get a big change out of. But anti-inflammatories help, pain relievers help, and then stretching and exercising the feet specifically actually helps too. That's can be an important thing to do. I also use moxa a lot for people's feet. I know I keep talking about moxa, but using heat on the feet on specific pressure points can make a big difference and can make a big improvement to circulation. But foot soaks are actually really helpful in terms of just in general applying that same heat to the entire foot. Interestingly, a few generations back, one of my ancestors, Barry Edward O'Mara, he used foot soaks a lot in his practice. They were maybe a more popular therapeutic thing at the time, but he was a very big proponent of people using the feet as a point of entry into the body for herbal medicines. And that was something that he would often have people do instead of taking medicines internally, is soaking their feet in them. And I'm not real clear on how well that works physiologically. I know that some things are absorbed through the skin, obviously, and some things are absorbed through the feet, have a lot of pores in them and so forth. But periodically that becomes, throughout history, periodically that becomes a popular route of administration for herbs. And it seems to kind of come and go from popularity, but it's not something that I've used a lot in my practice, except when I'm trying to treat the feet directly. But sometimes, when I was in Central Asia, people used henna on the soles of the feet as a treatment for allergies and like seasonal allergies, and that seemed to work pretty well, for instance, in a way that I thought was really interesting. So it is, maybe more of a transdermal route rather than taking something in and having it be digested. The idea is that it goes through your skin and directly into your system. But I don't think it works all the time, but sometimes it does. Would bunions fall into the joint category? Yeah, they would be like inflammation. So you can work on, a lot of the time they're things that you can put something on topically and to reduce the inflammation. But yeah, they would fall into that same general category of they're kind of not super long-term things necessarily, but they're more like medium term, I guess. They're not an immediate injury, but they're not something that takes years to happen either. All right. The other thing about feet that's really important is, care of the nails, making sure that they are trimmed properly so that they don't get ingrown can be a big deal. And it can be something that people struggle with too. A lot of people, just like I said before, when people get older and their flexibility and eyesight isn't as good, sometimes the ability to take care of their own toenails can be something that gets sacrificed, or something that they don't do as much anymore because it's a lot more difficult than it used to be. And also, not a comfortable thing to ask somebody else to do necessarily, or maybe something that to a lot of people would seem extravagant to go and pay someone to do, but it really can be worth it, because if they're as long as wherever they're getting it done is hygienic, having their nails trimmed and things like that can really keep their feet healthy, because if the nail becomes ingrown, it can cause injury and infection. And also, if it's too long, it can kind of create a space that can be a way for fungus to get started. More of an opening as the nail is longer from the nail bed, and it can kind of peel back a little more easily if it catches on something. So anyway, that's something to be aware of in people that you might be taking care of, or people that you might be caring for, is that's sometimes a challenge for some people. All right. Any questions about foot care in general? All right.
I have one.
Yeah.
What about for things like plantar fasciitis? Are there any things or ways that you can assist with that other than stretching and proper footwear?
Well, warmth and stretching are the main things. Reducing inflammation helps too. And the other thing is diet and kidney function, because if somebody is not getting adequate hydration, or if they're not getting adequate electrolytes, they're going to be much more likely to have cramping and tension that they're holding in the muscles of the base of their feet, and that can lead to that becoming a more chronic situation of plantar fasciitis and or foot cramps. But yeah, stretching and heat are really like the most immediately relieving things. And like I said, the ginger, which is anti-inflammatory, reducing the inflammation while increasing circulation is really important too. So, maybe ginger internally and massaging the area with cayenne liniment while stretching it would be a good thing to do in that situation.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Yeah. All right. Well, be keeping an eye on the natural world that's going on out there, and how things are starting to change as we move through winter. And the days are getting longer now, so as the photo period is getting longer, the plant kingdom is going to get more and more active from now, or from 2 weeks ago forward. So be keeping an eye out for things. And if you're still collecting plants for your plant collection, still finding plants for your plant collection, you might notice that there are some things out there that are still putting up the occasional bloom, still growing. It'll be a while before we start to get new blooms, maybe another month or a little more, but the plants are kind of moving in that direction. So I encourage everybody you can to get out there and look at what the plants around you are doing. Even though it's not going to be as dramatic or as flashy as it would be in the spring and summertime, it's definitely still going on. The plants are still up to something, and they're still doing stuff. So get out there and acquaint yourselves with them to the best of your ability. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. And for those of you who get Square invoices who have asked me to send those, I will be sending those out in the next day or so. So be on the lookout for those. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.